policies and problems President Bush, although not the choice the majority of voters, August P. LV pushed his conservative agenda, tax cuts, federal aid to faith-based service organizations, school choice, privatization of Social Security and Medicare, cession to Roe v. Wade, drilling for oil and gas in the Alaska Wildlife Refuge, and voluntary environmental standards, and Republican vote tax cut. In 2001, Congress passed a $1.35 trillion tax cut, spread over 10 years. The bill gave all taxpayers an immediate $300 or $600 rebate, reduced all tax brackets, and increased both child credit and limits for IRA and 401k contributions. Many Democrats attacked the bill for giving half of the tax cuts to the top 2% of income earners, by lowering the top tax bracket from 39.5% to 35% and eliminating estate taxes of the wealthy over a 10-year period. When the tax cut was passed, the government was running a surplus, and the stock market was at one of its highs. Education reform. In 2002, President Bush signed a bipartisan education bill, the No Child Left Behind Act. The act aimed to improve student performance and close the gap between well-to-do and poor students in the public schools through nationwide testing of all students, student transfer rights to better public schools, improved reading programs, and training of high-quality teachers. Later in 2002, the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision ruled that local government funding of school vouchers for religious schools did not violate the Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment. These victories for school choice advocates put more pressure on public schools to raise student performance or lose funding. Recession of 2001. The technology boom of the 1990s came to an end in 2000. The stock market crashed, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 38% from its highs in 2000 to its lows in 2002. The country experienced in 2001 its first recession since the early 1990s. By 2002, the unemployment rate had climbed to 6%, the highest in 8 years, while the number of people living in poverty increased for the first time in 8 years. The Federal Reserve fought the recession by cutting interest rates to 1.25%, the lowest in 50 years. The recession, along with Bush's tax cuts and increased defense spending, turned the surplus of the past Clinton budgets into more than a $400 billion annual deficit by 2004. Corporate corruption, fraud, and dishonesty committed by business leaders also hurt the stock market and consumer confidence in the economy. 660 for large corporations, such as Enron and WorldCom, had Cook the accounting companies falsified earnings and profits. With the help of ACO Inc. lenders, public opinion forced the president and Congress to call for STRA and Exchange Commissioning the regulatory powers of the securities and time for those convicted of these white-collar crimes. Revelations of Special corruption gave new life to a congressional bill to stop the flood of banned and interest money into political campaigns. The law that passed donations, known as soft money, to political parties. However, it did stop advertising these special interest groups. The war on terrorism or terrorism nations suspected of supporting it dominated SF policy after September 11, 2001. George W. Bush entered the White House with no foreign policy experience, but surrounded himself with veteran prior republicans. General Colin Powell, his Secretary of State, Bushkin became the first African American to hold the position. President prudent and aggressive epic won over his fellow Americans, but promoted criticism of the United States around the world and even among allies. Roots of terrorism. The United States was faulted by many in the Arab world for siding with Israel in the deadly Cyclot. Palestinian combining Israeli reprisals that killed hundreds of innocent people. However, causes of anti-Americanism often went deeper. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire, the last of the Islamic empires, was replaced in the Middle East by Western-style secular nation-states, Arial-Giusfundamentalists decried modernization and the corruption of the House of Islam, an ancient Islamic ideal of a realm governed by the precepts of the Quran. The stationing of American troops in the Middle East after the Persian Gulf War was seen as another violation of their lands. Resurgent Islamic fundamentalism, along with poor economies and despotic political conditions in the Middle East, provided extremists with a fertile breeding ground for new recruits. The former included Osama bin Laden and his associates in Al-Qaeda, the base who preached jihad, or holy war, against the Jews and Crusaders. The bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City in 1993 brought home for the first time the threat posed by these extremists. In 1998, the United States responded to the terrorist bombing of two U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania by bombing Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan and the Sudan. Osama bin Laden had been identified as a leader and financial supporter of this terrorism, and under U.S. pressure he fled to Afghanistan. There he allied himself with the Taliban, the Islamic extremists who ruled the country. The September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the downing of a fourth plane in Pennsylvania, which altogether claimed over 3,000 lives, galvanized public opinion as nothing had done since the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. President Bush's aggressive appears Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden wanted, dead or alive, and gained support of Congress and most nations, including Pakistan and Russia, to pursue and root out terrorists. In the United States, the assets of groups suspected of supporting terrorism were frozen, suspects were rounded up, and an executive order set up secret hearings and military tribunals to try foreigners accused of terrorism. After this watershed event, most Americans accepted background checks, airport and border searches, detentions, and new police powers. But some question at loss of privacy and civil liberties. War in Afghanistan. After the Taliban refused to turn over bin Laden and his associates, their government was quickly overthrown in the fall of 2000 by a combination of U.S. bombing, anti-Taliban Northern Alliance troops, and American Special Forces. Into 2003, U.S. and Afghan forces continued to pursue the remnants of Al-Qaeda in the mountains bordering Pakistan, but they failed to capture bin Laden. Afghanistan remained unstable and divided by tribal conflicts and Taliban sympathizers. Homeland Security. First the Democrats, then the president, called for a new cabinet position for domestic defense. The Homeland Security Department combined over 20 federal agencies with 170,000 employees, including Customs, Immigration and Naturalization, the Coast Guard, and the Secret Service, in one of the largest government reorganizations since the creation of the Department of Defense after World War II. Many in Congress questioned why the FBI and the CIA were left out of the new department. In 2000, for a bipartisan National Commission on Terrorism also criticized the FBI and the CIA, as well as the Defense Department, for failing to work together to connect dots and uncover the September 11th plot. Under preserve from the familias of 9/11's victims, CONGRESSFINALYPASSCDMOST of the Commission's recommendations, including creating a Director of National Intelligence to coordinate the intelligence activities of, often is COMPETINGBUREAUCRACIS. Changing foreign policy. The Bush administration worked with European nations and Russia to expand the European Union and NATO, helped admit China to the World Trade Organization, and brokered conflicts between T&E nuclear powers of India and Pakistan. However, the Bush administration also refused to join the Kyoto Accord to prevent global warming, walked out of the United Nations Conference on Racism, and abandoned the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. Critics questioned whether the administration valued negotiation and cooperation with the nations of the world, or followed a unilateralist approach of the world's only military superpower. The threat of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists gave the Bush foreign policy team cause to question prior foreign policies. President Bush egged that the old policies of containment and nuclear deterrence were no longer effective in a world of stateless terrorists. To protect itself from its new foes, America would have to strike first. President Bush and the Republicans successfully made the war on terrorism the main issue of the congressional elections of 2002. The Republicans took control of the Senate again and strengthened their majority in the House. For the first time since the 1950s, the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress and the White House, and conservatives carried the Supreme Court on most issues. President Bush used the election returns to push through another round of tax cuts, which included the elimination of tax on stock dividends for investors and the reduction of taxes for married couples. Opponents argued that half of the tax cuts would go to the richest 10% of the population, and the cuts were irresponsible during wartime. Congress also fulfilled a campaign promise of President Bush to provide prescription drug coverage for seniors. Behind-the-scenes deals were being made to move Russia and the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan so the United States could move in and profit off of the highly concentrated areas of poppy and opiate fields. The natural farmers were harassed and labeled as violent extremists for trying to protect their lands from being colonized by the United States. Later to then create the opiate epidemic that ravished the Americas. This war on terrorism was a guise for a huge land takeover just following the war in Iraq that was approved by Congress. After hearing false testimony about weapons of mass destruction being cultivated in Iraq by the supposed dictator, Saddam perhaps, that too was just another smear campaign to take out prominent oil landowners. In his first State of the Union address in January 2002, President Bush singled out Iraq along with North Korea and Iran as the axis of evil. American intelligence found no link between Iraq's Saddam Hussein and the September 11th attacks, but the Bush administration pursued a preemptive attack on Iraq before Saddam Hussein could build and distribute weapons of mass destruction, nuclear and biological weapons to terrorists. Critics of the policy overseas and at home charged that the real purpose of the war was regime change and that the administration failed to work with its allies and the United Nations. Late in 2000, Secretary of State Powell negotiated an inspection plan with the United Nations Security Council in which Iraq accepted. In the following months, UN inspectors failed to find weapons of mass in Iraq. In 2003, President Bush declared that Iraq had not complied with numerous United Nations resolutions since 1991, and the game was over. Without winning support of the United Nations Security Council, the United States launched the war on March 19th. With an air attack in less than 4 weeks, a combination of United States and British armed forces and Operation Iraqi Freedom overran Iraqi defenses, captured the capital Baghdad, and ended Hussein's dictatorship. However, the defeat of the Iraq army and the capture of Saddam Hussein in December 2003 did not end the violence. Diverse groups of Iraqi insurgents, many of them followers of the former dictator, and foreign fighters, some with connections to Al-Qaeda, tried to stop the political and physical reconstruction of Iraq. By mid-2005, more than 1,700 American soldiers had been killed and over 13,000 wounded in Iraq. The Bush administration faced criticism, especially from abroad, for going to war with faulty intelligence about weapons of mass destruction which were never found. The conduct of the war was also questioned for an inadequate number of United States troops sent to Iraq, failure to create a viable Iraqi army and police force, and the abusive treatment of prisoners held by United States forces. However, President Bush defended the war as part of his campaign against terrorism and gained ground in 2005 when the Iraqis held their first free election and created a National Assembly which selected a prime minister, cabinet ministries, and a committee to write a new constitution. The Sunni minority that ruled Iraq under Saddam Hussein also began working with Shiite majority and the Kurds and the new government, which lessened chances of civil war among the fractions in Iraq. America entered the 2004 elections divided not only over the war in Iraq, but also by the limited economic recovery tax cuts and the deficit and social issues such as gay marriage, abortion, and the role of religion and public institutions. The Democrats were optimistic as they faced an incumbent president with an approval rating of only 50%. Democratic voters in the primary selected Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts as their presidential candidate, and he chose a rival in the primary, Senator John Edwards of North Carolina, as his running mate. Senator Kerry attacked President Bush for his handling of the war and Iraq, favoring drug and insurance insurance companies pushing tax cuts for the wealthy and running up huge federal deficits. President Bush ran on his popular image as a strong and consistent leader in the war and a compassionate conservative. At home, he successfully painted his opponent as a flip-flopper on defense issues and a tax and spend liberal. The Bush-Cheney campaign successfully energized its conservative base on issues such as tax cuts, gay marriage, abortion, and the liberal media. Bush also benefited from the feeling that a wartime president and his team should have the opportunity to finish the job in Iraq. In November 2004 election, unlike the election of 2000, George W. Bush won both the popular vote and a clear electoral college vote majority. President Bush defeated Senator Kerry by about 3.5 million votes and captured 286 electoral votes to his opponent's 252. The country remained divided much as it was in 2000. Republicans won by heavy majorities in the South and the Western Heartland, adding Iowa and New Mexico in 2004, while the Democrats retained the urban Northeast, adding New Hampshire in 2004. And the West Coast states, Republicans also expanded their majorities in the Senate, in the House, and continued to gain on a state level, especially in the South, which left the party in the strongest position it had enjoyed since the 1920s. Both parties agreed that the Republicans used volunteers more successfully than the Democrats in registering and getting out their voters. Some analysis interpreted the election results as revealing a deep cultural divide between sophisticated, diverse, and international-minded coastal urban centers that voted Democratic and more traditional religious and nationalistic rural and small-town areas that went Republican. Democrats were left to wonder why low and middle-income workers continued seemingly to go against their own economic interest and vote Republican for moral issues such as gay marriages. In his second term, President Bush interpreted the election not only as a mandate to continue his foreign policy, but also to replace part of the Social Security system with private investment accounts. This was part of an effort to move Americans from dependence on government programs toward what he called an ownership society. The president, with the support of a 55-vote Republican majority in the Senate, was also in a position to fill federal court vacancies with conservative judges. By 2005, the conservative political resurgence of the 1980s and 1990s seemed nearly complete. It is too early to understand fully the importance of the events from the last 2 decades of the 20th century, but certain trends are apparent. Basic concepts such as freedom and rights were being reshaped by conservative politics. In the decades after the New Deal in World War II, freedom was associated with the economic security and the enjoyment of equal rights, which were largely guaranteed by federal government laws and court interpretations of constitutional amendments. In the 1980s and the 1990s, freedom was frequently defined as the absence of big government and federal regulations. Eric Foner and the Story of American Freedom 1999 attributed this change to reactions to forced desegregation and the 1950s and 1960s liberal court rulings banning prayer in schools and laws and court decisions allowing free speech and abortion rights. Many conservative commentators equated freedom with unregulated capitalism. Father argued, for example, that the freedom of speech issues in the 1990s were raised not by radicals, but by corporate interests fighting limits on campaign financing and restrictions on the concentrated ownership of the media. President Reagan had resurrected the states' right debate in his 1980 inaugural address, documented page 672 as Congress shifted more responsibilities back to the states' conservative majorities on the Supreme Court in the 1990s also reasserted the state sovereignty and the immunity of the states to federal laws. Whether the states or the federal government can better protect the rights of citizens often depends on how one defines such basic concepts as freedom and one's view of the history of federal-state conflicts from the time of Hamilton and Jefferson through the modern civil rights movement. In the early 21st century, it seems fairly certain that the balance between the powers of the federal government and the state governments will remain a central issue for the nation and for students of its history. Key names, events, and terms: Conservative Religious Fundamental Political Action Committee's Abortion Rights Roe versus Wade, Reverse Discrimination, Regents of University California versus Becky Ronald Reagan, Supply Side Economics, Reaganomics, Sandra D. O'Connor and William Rehnquist, Budget and Trade Deficits, Evil Empire, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, Nicaragua, Sandinistas, Iran-Contra Affair, Middle East, Palestine Liberation Organization, Mikhail Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika, George H. Bush, and Dinquil, the Soviet Union breakup, end of Cold War, Boris Yeltsin is Panama invasion 1989, Saddam Hussein, Persian Gulf War 1991, Operation Desert Storm is Americans with Disabilities Act 1990, William Bill Clinton, Albert Gore, North American Free Trade Agreement, Oklahoma City bombing, e-commerce, Clinton and impeachment trial, Madeleine K. Albright, Yugoslavia breakup, Balkan Wars, Bosnia, Kosovo, ethnic cleansing, nuclear proliferation, globalization, World Trade Organization, European Union, Europe, metropolitan areas, Rome metropolitan areas, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, Bush versus Gore, education reform, No Child Left Behind Act, corporate corruption campaign, finance reform, terrorism, war on terrorism, September 11, 2001, attacks on the United States, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan, axis of evil, Homeland Security Department, Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, regime change, preemptive strike, United Nations, inspections, Powell, Iraq war, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that sums it up for 1980 to 2008. Notice how they didn't mention anything about profits from opiates or poppy plants or anything like that. That's odd. What are we gaining from going to war? Do we just go to war to help people get out of abusive relationships? We don't do it for profit. We don't gain anything except for looking that like assholes and a crisis.